Welcome. This is Travis Wright coming to you from beautiful Austin, Texas today. And this is the first session in the Bare Metal to Private Cloud TechNet webcast series. Very glad to have you here today. I started this series by going to the Enterprise Engineering Center a few weeks ago, actually, to use some of the big hardware that they have there to actually simulate the process of deploying a private cloud, starting from the bare metal, deploying the operating systems, the hardware that was necessary, all the prerequisite software, and eventually deploying all of System Center to manage that. So today, the first session is going to be kind of a beginning with the end in mind session. So what we want to do is just sort of set the framework for where we're going with this series and, sort of think about what is the ultimate vision we're trying to achieve. And then the remaining 7 sessions in this 8-part series will cover the topics of how to deploy a private cloud from bare metal. So to get started here, just a little bit of background on me. I'm a principal program manager here at Microsoft. I've actually been working on System Center for the entire 10 years that I've been at Microsoft. I've been a PM or a lead PM on many of the different areas of operations manager and service manager. And I'm currently in a role now where I operate across the entire System Center suite, excluding configuration manager. And my role is to kind of be the community lead for our team, engage with strategic customers and partners and help them to deploy System Center, help them build solutions on top of System Center, etc. And I interface with our marketing team from our engineering team and present at conferences. And throughout all of this interaction that I have with customers and partners and marketing and so on, I drive that feedback back into the product team to help shape the direction of System Center. I also used to be a developer prior to coming to Microsoft, so I occasionally still write code, and you've probably seen some of my contributions out there in the community, such as the Exchange connector or SMlets for Service Manager. So just as a quick overview of what this series is all about, as I mentioned, this is an 8-part series. This is the first part beginning with the end in mind, where we'll be talking about sort of what is the purpose of building a private cloud, how does System Center fit into that, and especially we'll focus today on the cloud services management pack for System Center that allows you to operate your private cloud using System Center. So once we have sort of our goal in mind, then we'll go through another series of presentations that we'll talk about first how to deploy and configure your hardware, what types of hardware you would want to choose for a private cloud, what types of software are required as a prerequisite software platform, such as Windows, SQL Server, and so on. And then we'll step into creating a clustered Hyper-V and installing a highly available virtual machine manager cluster. And virtual machine manager is part of the System Center suite. Then we'll use virtual machine manager to create clouds, create host groups, and so on. We'll use Operations Manager to set up a infrastructure for discovery and monitoring of our private cloud. And then we'll dump that data that's being discovered from Operations Manager into Service Manager and configure Service Manager for self-service request fulfillment and so on. And then we'll deploy Orchestrator for automation purposes. And lastly, we'll integrate together all of the System Center suite components that are involved in providing a private cloud. So just real quick, I'm sure a lot of you have heard the private cloud terminology a lot, but for the purposes of this conversation today, I just want to make sure everybody's on the same page. A private cloud is a hardware platform that's optimized for hosting virtual machines that provide services from an IT organization to, let's call them, customers or consumers. And this hardware platform is designed for reliability, so we want to have high availability built into the private cloud solution. We want to have elasticity, meaning that we want to be able to scale up and scale down how much of that hardware we're using at any given time, given the demand. So for example, if we have a web server farm and we've got a promotion going on from our sales team, we may want to have 10 web servers available. Once that promotion is over, we may want to sort of scale that back down to just a couple of web servers. Similarly, if we have multiple virtual machines running on a Hyper-V cluster, we may want to move all of those virtual machines from one node of the cluster to another, and then sort of put that one node of the cluster into a pause state so it's not consuming power and cooling and so on. And it should also be designed to support multiple tenants. And so the idea here is that you may have different departments within your organization, or if you're a hoster, you may have multiple customers that are all coming to you with a request to manage their virtual machines running on your private cloud. Then we also want to design for agility. So this allows us to move virtual machines around from one place to another as needed. And this private cloud could be built on various hypervisor technologies such as Hyper-V or VMware. And lastly, a very important component of a private cloud is the management tools that you use to manage that private cloud, the APIs that are available around that for automation. And then lastly, various user interfaces that are exposed to tenants and customers for them to be able to view what's going on and make various requests. So just a quick overview of System Center for those of you that aren't familiar with it. Virtual Machine Manager is the component of the System Center suite which is used to control Hyper-V or VMware virtual machines across the private cloud. Use that to provision and deprovision private cloud resources such as storage, networks, and so on. We can also configure our private cloud, decide what portion of our infrastructure fabric we're going to create a private cloud out of. So this could be a number of different hosts, networks that are associated with those hosts, storage, and so on. We create virtual private clouds, if you will, based upon portions of that hardware infrastructure. Then we can create role-based security around those cloud resources. And at that point, we can then start to deploy services. Those would be applications and those sorts of things on top of this private cloud. And we can also use Virtual Machine Manager to patch the hosts. Operations Manager is the monitoring component of the System Center suite. You can manage it. You can manage the private cloud platform itself at the network layer, at the hardware layer, at the host layer, and you can also use it to manage the guest operating systems as well as the applications and services that are running on those guests. Service Manager is the ITIL or MOF process management and automation component of the System Center suite. It provides out-of-the-box functionality for incident, change, problem, release, configuration, knowledge management, and service level management. It also provides in System Center 2012 a service catalog where users can go and request different things that they need through that service catalog, and that ultimately becomes service requests or incidents, which are then processed through the process. The Service Manager component is also the configuration management database, or CMDB, for the System Center suite. And there's a management pack that you can import into Service Manager to provide governance, risk, and compliance management. Then there's Orchestrator, which is the systems automation component of the System Center suite. And it provides a drag and drop and configure simple designer interface where you can create your own custom workflows to automate systems behaviors between systems, within a system, and so on. And we have integration packs for all of the System Center components, as well as integration packs for things like VMware and other third-party management systems. So those are the 4 components that we'll be covering as part of this Bare Metal to Private Cloud series. There are 3 other components that I should mention, but I didn't have time to include in this series. And those are App Controller, which is the self-service portal for consumers to be able to manage their VMs and services across both the private cloud being managed by Virtual Machine Manager, as well as the public cloud being managed in Azure. There's also Configuration Manager, which is a long-standing component of the System Center suite, and that includes software distribution, patching, and configuration management. And then Data Protection Manager is the backup solution component as a part of System Center. So if we were to look at this visually, we could sort of think about there being different layers of the private cloud management platform. At the front end, we have the self-service interfaces where consumers or customers can come in and they can interact with App Controller to manage their virtual machines or services across both the private cloud infrastructure managed by VMM as well as the public cloud being run in Azure, and the Service Manager self-service portal. And then we have a service delivery and automation layer, which is orchestrated by the orchestrator component as well as workflows that run inside of Service Manager to manage the process workflows. And then the other components of the suite, Virtual Machine Manager, Operations Manager, Configuration Manager, and Data Protection Manager, are responsible for configuring and deploying applications and services onto the public cloud, private cloud, in both either physical or virtual configurations. And then as those applications and services are running, those components are responsible for monitoring and operating those applications and services. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and start talking now about the Cloud Services Process Management Pack. So this is a free download that's available from Microsoft Download site. And at a high level, the Management Pack contains two different pieces of configuration that's imported into System Center. The first is some information that's imported as a Management Pack into System Center Service Manager. It includes some additional data classes, some folders and views that are visible in the console, service request templates, service catalog content such as request offerings and a service offering, workflows to automate the process portion, and some administrative UI. On the Orchestrator side, it also comes with some runbooks that you can import into Orchestrator to automate the management of your private cloud. We'll see exactly what that entails here. So at a very high level, by importing all of this, you're able to light up these new request offerings on the Service Manager service catalog. And these are some of the most common tasks that you would want to do around managing a private cloud. So for example, we may want to register a tenant. We would then want to grant that tenant some cloud resources. So that's where we would subscribe to cloud resources. Once the tenant has cloud resources, then they can go and they can request virtual machines, either using a process that requires approval or some other steps, or a more streamlined process which maybe doesn't require approval. And then they can also request services to be deployed on their portion of the private cloud. And then the remaining scenarios here are just sort of variations on that. We can update the tenant's registration, we can update their cloud resources subscription, we can update a virtual machine, we can cancel the registration or the subscription. So each of these request offerings is available now through the service catalog. Somebody can go up there, they can request it by filling out a form and submitting that. And based upon the service request template behind that, it will create a service request in Service Manager. And then Service Manager will walk through the defined process of fulfilling that type of request. So there may be some automated steps, some manual steps, some steps which require approval, and so on. And some portions of these workflows are automated using the Orchestrator Runbooks to communicate out to Virtual Machine Manager, for example. So with that, we'll just go straight into a demo of the Cloud Services Management Pack so you can get a feel of how this operates. So I will now share out my desktop. Hopefully you can see this here in just a second. Okay, so we're going to start out here in the Service Manager console. This is an installed application that typically IT analysts or systems administrators would run on their desktops or laptops. And right now we're looking at the administrative portion of the Service Manager console. And when you import the Cloud Services Management Pack, it'll add this new node to the administration workspace here for cloud services. And this provides a number of different steps that are required in order to be able to install and configure all of the cloud services functionality. So the first thing that we want to do as a prerequisite to be able to use the Cloud Services MP is to create a connector to Virtual Machine Manager, to Operations Manager, and to Orchestrator. Later in the series, in that section that we have about the System Center components, I'll actually go into each of these steps in detail. And then we can configure the resources that come over from Virtual Machine Manager. We can configure some general and cost properties associated with the solution, create cost centers, and so on. And we can also create catalog groups. Catalog groups allow us to control access to request offerings and service offerings on the service catalog. So if, for example, I only want certain people to be able to request a new tenant, I can lock that down so that only those people are allowed to make that type of request. I can also then create user roles for tenant administrators and cloud resource subscription users. So this allows some people to come into Service Manager and have a more expanded scope of responsibility using the Service Manager console and the self-service portal. And we can also set up notification channels and subscriptions. This uses standard Service Manager functionality for sending out notifications at various points in the process, and as well as subscribing to certain types of changes that might happen that you want to be notified about. And then you can also change the request offerings that we provide out of the box. So if there's some additional questions you want to prompt the user for, if you want to change the wording, etc., you can go to this portion of the console and configure that. So let me just point out here that you can ask questions or provide comments in the window there near the video feed. So if you want to ask those questions in there, I'll try to monitor that and respond to any questions that people have. Okay, looks like we have comments from people saying hi from all over the world, so welcome to all of you from all over the place. Okay, so I'll go ahead now, but feel free to ask any questions you like there in the pane alongside the video feed there. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to the configuration items workspace, and I'll show you some of the additional folders and views that the Cloud Services Management Pack introduces to the console. And they're all contained here underneath this Cloud Services folder in the configuration items workspace. We'll just start here. We'll take a look at, here's a Cloud Resources subscription that I created. We can pop this open, we can take a look at it. Now it also provides some custom forms in the management pack as well. So this is a custom form that's used to display cloud resource subscriptions. We can see names, what tenant is associated with this, and what the quota is that's allocated for this cloud resource, and then which VMM user role this is associated with, and who the cloud resource subscription users are. And then over here on the Cloud Resources tab, we can see which VMM server this is related to, which VM templates are granted to this cloud resource, which clouds, which logical networks, which service templates, and virtual machines and services are related to this particular cloud resource. And you can see here that it's also related to a tenant. Okay, so we'll go and take a look at this here in just a second. Okay, then we have the cost centers view. This is where you can go and create additional cost centers. Nothing real magical there. Now, these logical networks, these are actually coming in from Virtual Machine Manager. So I can define my Virtual Machine Manager logical networks in the VMM console, and the integration between Virtual Machine Manager and Service Manager will automatically bring those logical networks into the Service Manager CMDB and keep those up to date. The same is true of service templates. The services, these are running inside of Virtual Machine Manager, and they come over to the Service Manager CMDB via the Virtual Machine Manager to Operations Manager to Service Manager connection. And then storage classifications, this comes directly from Virtual Machine Manager to Service Manager. We've got our Tenants View, where we can view all the different tenants that are in our CMDB. VIP templates come from Virtual Machine Manager, as well as Virtual Machine templates. And then here we can also see all of the active virtual machines, and this comes to us from the VMM to OM to SM integration. Now, I also added here a custom view which displays all of the clouds. So the clouds are coming over into the Service Manager CMDB. I created a custom view which simply displays all objects of the cloud class, and those are listed here. Now, what is sort of the purpose of getting all of this data into the Service Manager CMDB? Well, that's so that we can drive our experience for people making different types of requests. So for example, if somebody's going to request new cloud capacity, we need to decide, which Virtual Machine Manager server is that going to be associated with, which private cloud is that going to be associated with, which virtual machine templates are we going to give them, which storage are we going to give them. So all of that information, we want to be able to just pick and choose from a list. And by having all this information in the Service Manager CMDB, we can configure that as people make these different requests. Okay, now let's see if there's any questions here. Okay, so the question is the Runbook download a must for running the Orchestrator? So that's a good question. The workflows, the runbooks that come with the Cloud Services Management Pack are designed to work with this particular solution, but it's not necessarily required to manage your private cloud. In fact, you don't really need the Cloud Services Process Management Pack to manage your private cloud using System Center. The Cloud Services Process Management Pack is really just a way for us to accelerate people's usage of System Center to manage their private cloud. Think of it kind of like a template. You import this template and then you can change it from there. So it's sort of a way for you to get a head start on things. But you really could build all of this from the ground up. In fact, we normally do a lot of demos of creating automated virtual machine provisioning using just Service Manager and Orchestrator, or it could even be done using just Service Manager with a workflow engine. So there's really a lot of ways to accomplish this, but the idea with the Cloud Services MP is to make it easier for you to get started with using System Center to manage your private cloud. That said, you could import the Orchestrator runbooks into Orchestrator, and you could modify those runbooks if you wanted to do some things differently there. That's perfectly fine. Or you can create your own custom Orchestrator runbooks from scratch. Or, as I mentioned, you don't necessarily need to have Orchestrator, although that makes it a lot easier. You could do all of this automation using the Service Manager workflow engine as well. Okay, and then the next question is the runbook included in the Orchestrator download, or are they both separate downloads? So when you download the Cloud Services Management Pack, that includes the Service Manager Management Packs, the Orchestrator runbooks, and an installer which helps you install both of those components in the appropriate place. So it's all part of one download package. All right, so no other questions in the queue now, so I will move on. And what we'll do now is, just in the interest of time, I've recorded demos of using the Cloud Services Management Pack as WMV files. And really the purpose of this is I've gone through and I've cut out all of the points in the demo where you would have to wait for various things to happen. So this way the demo goes much faster and that kind of thing. And we don't have to worry about the demo gods being with us or not. We can just go for it. So this first demo that I'll show you here is to create a tenant from the self-service portal. So the idea is that maybe I'm a central IT organization within my company, and the finance department has now come to me and they want to run some of their virtual machines on the private cloud service that I'm now providing to them. So this is how I would register that new finance department as a tenant. Okay, so we're now inside of the Service Manager self-service portal, and here is the form that somebody would fill out to register a tenant. So you can see here that this form is actually what we call configuration driven. So there's no need to design the forms. You just define which questions you want to ask the user, what type of response you expect to get back. In this case, this is a text response that we're going to have, and so therefore we're going to display a text box to them. And we can configure the validation criteria. So for example, this has a red outline around the text box and red text here because we want the user to provide a response here. This is a required field. The next field here asks them for the urgency, and you can see that this is a drop-down field and so on. So based upon the type of response we expect to get back, we can automatically generate this form, so it's not necessary for somebody to go in and actually design the form. So we'll just watch quickly as I fill out this form here. Providing the service request title, choosing the urgency, entering the name of the finance tenant, giving them some code, and then here I'm associating it with an existing cost center. Click Next. Here we provide the email address for the tenant, and we'll enter the list of users or user groups that will be associated with this tenant. Now in this case, I used an AD group that doesn't actually exist, so we'll actually see that that's where that normally works, but I didn't provide one that actually exists. So at this point, we've now created a service request that exists inside of the Service Manager database, and now we're accessing that service request through the Service Manager console here. And I'll just pause this here for a second. So you can see that it grabs who the affected user was. In this case, I was the one that made the request, and so my name is here as the affected user. The title of the service request that I entered has been populated here. The urgency value that I chose has been set here. But some of these values have come from the template. So for example, the priority being medium, that came from the template. And down here in the user input section, we can see all of the inputs that the user provided to create this. And now we'll flip over to the activities tab, which is where we see what the process is for fulfilling this type of request. So in this case here, the first activity that we have in the process is an automation activity. And this goes, and if I had the Cloud Services MP fully configured, it would go and get a list of people that are required to approve adding new tenants, and it would add those approvers to this review activity here. In this case, since I don't have that configured, this step was skipped. And now we'll go on to the review activity here. If I open up this review activity, you can see that as of right now, there's no approvers in here. So this review activity will just go to an approved status immediately. And that will then be followed by an automated activity that runs inside of the Service Manager workflow engine, which will create the tenant. Okay, so that's now completed, and the next step would be to execute another workflow activity here, which scopes the access to that tenant. So again, this is sort of a fully automated procedure. The only sort of manual step that we had here was the approval. And if we wanted to, we could go in and remove that approval step and have it be a fully automated experience. So it comes down to what your process is. You could add in additional review steps. You could add in manual steps. You could add in other automation steps that you want to have. So again, it kind of comes down to this is a starting point. You can come in here and configure things as needed to do different processes that are required by your organization. Okay, so at this point, I'll go now over to the configuration item for Workspace and take a look at the Tenants View here. And inside of the Tenants View, we'll see that this new finance tenant has been created. If we open up the tenant form, we can see that the email address that was provided has been populated in here, the tenant name. It's associated to the cost center I selected. And if I'd added the correct username and domain name in the request form, those would have been automatically populated in here as well. But you can see that you can also add administrators as needed here or remove them. And that's it. So we've got our tenant created. So that's sort of the first step in the process for onboarding a tenant into managing their private cloud. All right, so I'll stop for a second here and take some questions. Okay, so there's a question here which is basically, do you have a test environment where somebody can go and try this type of thing out without having to actually install all of the software? We actually don't have an environment like that that's available publicly, but we do have our Microsoft field staff equipped with demo environments that they can use. So if you have a Microsoft representative that you work with, they can come in and quickly demonstrate this type of functionality to you, as well as stand up a private cloud proof of concept that you can play around with. And there's lots of demo videos that are available on the web as well. One resource I think is great is watching the recordings from the Microsoft Management Summit. So all of those sessions for the first time ever have been recorded and been made available after the event as on-demand video streams that you can watch. And the next question is this interoperable with VMware? And the answer to that is yes. Virtual Machine Manager manages both VMware and Hyper-V. So when we choose to deploy a virtual machine, as we see later on in this scenario, that virtual machine can be deployed onto either a private cloud running Hyper-V underneath it or a private cloud running VMware underneath it. We also have integration packs for Orchestrator that you can use to automate things running against VMware. Okay, and there's also a VMware monitoring solution for Operations Manager available from one of our partners called VM. Okay, and then there's a question here, what is tenant exactly and why is it called tenant? Okay, so a tenant, sort of think of somebody that is running an apartment building. So you're probably familiar with that concept. I've got an apartment building that I'm running, and I'm renting out or letting out space in that apartment building, and those people that are renting that space from me to live in that apartment building are called tenants. So the same concept applies to a private cloud. So the analogy there is that a private cloud is the equivalent of an apartment building, and you have space available to rent in your apartment building, and the people that come to you and want to rent that space on your private cloud, we call them tenants. Okay. All right, so there's no other questions in the queue right now, so I'll move on. The next scenario that we'll talk about here is creating cloud resources. So I'll fire up this demo video here. And in this demo video, same type of thing, we go to a request offering form here from the service catalog. Okay, so this is subscribe to cloud resources. We're going to enter a service request title, similar to what we did before. Now, personally, if I were running this, I would set the title of the request in the template and not even prompt the user for this, because it's really not necessary. And then we can prompt the user for the urgency, select which tenant we're granting cloud resources to, can provide a name for the subscription. And here we can start to allocate out resources. So for this particular subscription, we want to give them 100 gigs of disk space, 100 gigs of RAM. This is obviously configurable. You probably want to give them more disk space than just 100 gigs. We can control the number of virtual machines they're allowed to have, the number of virtual CPUs they can have access to, which virtual machine templates they can see, and then which logical networks they can use, which storage is available to them to use. And again, all of this information is coming from Virtual Machine Manager. So we're tying it back into Virtual Machine Manager, which is used to control the private cloud. And then we choose which service templates are available. We could choose placement tags, which helps us control what to place things on. Actually, let me just back up here 1 second. And just want to point out here this option here at the bottom. So it says, should virtual machines in this cloud resource subscription be requested through Service Manager? So what we can do here is we can actually set it up such that anytime somebody wants to request a new virtual machine or deprovision a virtual machine, we can enforce that that request has to go through Service Manager and go through the process that's required for doing that, which may include approvals or manual steps or other automated tasks that need to happen. Or if we choose no here, a self-service user can go up to the app controller interface of System Center, and they can start and stop and request new VMs and deploy new VMs and stop those VMs at will without having to go through a process. So that might be good for sort of a development or test cloud. Okay, and then here, similar to what we saw before, we'll enter the subscription users. So these are people that are allowed to consume resources out of this subscription by requesting new virtual machines. Okay, view our stuff and then actually submit it. And this will now result in a new service request which has been created inside of Service Manager. Same pattern that we saw before, where a new service request has been created. Some of the fields have been populated in here. We flip over to the Activities tab and we can see the process for fulfilling this type of request. It starts out with assigning the implementer. So what this does is it looks at who the tenant administrators are and it assigns them as the assigned to person for a manual activity. Now I don't have this fully configured yet, so you'll see here that on the manual activity form that comes up, the implementer is blank, but normally this would be populated with who's responsible for verifying the cloud services request and changing anything that's necessary there before the request is actually fulfilled. So in this case, we can see that the responses that the user provided here in terms of the storage, the memory, and so on have all been passed into this activity here. And the person that's responsible for allocating this resource on the private cloud can take a look at this request. And here I was like, well, no, actually I am going to change some things. So I marked this task as completed. And then I go in and actually change the number of virtual CPUs from 10 to 1. Okay. So at this point, it'll now create a new cloud resource subscription that only has one virtual CPU instead of the 10 that the user originally requested. So going on here now, you can see that this RB activity, this is actually what we call a runbook activity, and that is where we call out to Orchestrator, pass some information to it that it then uses to go and actually create the user role inside of Virtual Machine Manager that has this cloud resource scope associated with it. So one of the nice things about the functionality here is that you can go into the runbook activity inside of Service Manager, click on that link that you saw there, and that'll open the Orchestrator orchestration console in context to that particular runbook. So we're now looking at the Orchestrator orchestration console, which is a web-based interface. Here we can see the most recent execution of that runbook. You can see that I actually recorded that early this morning. And at this point, we can now look at the details of this request. And if we flip over to the Activity Details tab here, you can see what happened. And you'll notice that each of these activities is executed successfully. And so if we now go into the Orchestrator console, you can see each of the different Orchestrator Runbook activities that are defined. So we'll start here with the initialize data activity, where the activity ID is passed in from Service Manager as well as all the input parameters that the user provided. So this is where we get information like which cloud, which virtual machine templates to grant access to, which storage, which networks, and so on. All that information is passed in here to the input parameters as a wad of XML. And then this next activity, parse input, is actually just a PowerShell script that parses out that XML input and stores some of the input as variables and passes it along to the create VMM user role PowerShell script. And this PowerShell script actually goes and creates a virtual machine manager user role that's scoped to the resources that we've granted them access to. So things like how many vCPUs they get, how much memory they get, how much storage space they get, which VM templates they have access to, and so on. And then the last activity in this process just takes the output of this runbook and stores it back in the activity work item inside of Service Manager. So at this point, we can now flip back over here to Service Manager console. We can see that the runbook activity is completed. We go now to the Virtual Machine Manager console, and we can see that there's been a new user role created here. And the scope has been allocated to the private cloud. You can see here that the resource utilization that we configured has been allocated. So you can see there's only one virtual CPU, 10 gigs of memory, 100 gigs of storage, and so on. Okay, and then you can also see that the virtual machine templates that we selected have been granted, and the service template. And if we go now into Service Manager, we can see that there's a new cloud resource subscription object that's been created. And you can see that all of the quota associated with that is stored in here, as well as the relationship to the VMM user role. And over here on the Cloud Resources tab, we can see exactly which resources have been allocated in terms of VM templates, clouds, logical networks, services, and so on, and the relationship back to the tenant. Okay, so that's the end of that demo. Let's see if there's any questions in the queue now. Okay, so the first question is, did you customize the management pack defaults for this demo? No, I can't really. The only customization I can think of that I made to this environment was to add a new folder for clouds and a new view for clouds. For whatever reason, we don't ship that view out of the box, even though it would be pretty handy. But other than that, this is just standard functionality out of the box. In fact, I haven't even fully configured it. We'll see that in the 7th session that we have at the end of this series, how to fully configure the Cloud Services MP. Okay, next question is, the concept of Orchestrator exists in VMware as well. Does having Orchestrator for both System Center and VMware deployed cause any guest conflicts, and can we work with both in a mixed environment? Meaning, will SC workflows manage VMware guests and vice versa? Okay, so yes, VMware has an Orchestrator concept as well. Our Orchestrator component in the System Center suite will interact with VMware in two different ways. One is that it can make calls to Virtual Machine Manager and have Virtual Machine Manager integrate with VMware. So for example, we could instruct Virtual Machine Manager to deploy a new VM that happens to be getting deployed to a VMware host. Another way that you can integrate Orchestrator with VMware is to use the Orchestrator integration pack for VMware. So in that case, we could directly query VMware, get back a list of virtual machines, choose some subset of those virtual machines that we want to stop, for example, and stop those VMs on VMware. So both of those are options. Virtual Machine Manager, like I mentioned earlier, as well as Orchestrator, can manage both Hyper-V and VMware machines without a third-party add-on for VMware. The opposite is not true, though. You cannot manage Hyper-V VMs from VMware, nor can you, well, I'm sure with your Orchestrator solution in VMware, using some of their generic activities, you could talk back to the System Center APIs and effect some change there, but as far as I know, there's no out-of-the-box activities for VMware Orchestrator that would manage System Center. Okay, can some of the virtual machines in the private cloud be accessed from the internet without connecting with a VPN connection? For example, could a SharePoint document library with product literature be accessed over the internet? So that's certainly possible. Configuring a virtual machine for access from different boundaries of a network or the internet is really just no different than configuring a virtual machine, or than configuring a physical server in terms of which network subnets you connect it up to, which ports you have open, and so on. So that's certainly possible. The private cloud doesn't really change that conversation too much, but it does open up some additional possibilities, especially starting with Windows Server 2012 when we get network virtualization out of the box. Okay, the next one is there a pre-configured trial or lab of these tools available to drill into the concepts in more detail? So I mentioned this earlier that there's nothing available publicly, but there are lots of demo videos and sessions recorded from MMS, as well as the upcoming TechEd US conference. TechEd Europe is later this month, and the Microsoft Field has demo solutions available as well. Okay, and then, yeah, okay. So that's the end of the queue there, and we'll now go on to the last demo, which is once we have provisioned a tenant and cloud resources, we can now request a new virtual machine. So this is the demo for requesting a virtual machine. We go to the private cloud infrastructure services service offering, click on the request VM request offering, and go to the form for filling that out. We provide the title for the service request. Again, similar as we saw before, the urgency Here we're choosing the cloud resource subscription that we want to use to deploy this. Okay, so once we deploy this VM, this is going to decrement the available resources that are part of that cloud. So if I had 100 gigs of memory available before, and this is going to be a 10 gig VM, then I'm only going to have 90 gigs available from that point on. Then we can enter a name for the virtual machines, and this can match a pattern if you want. If you're going to deploy multiple virtual machines, you can do that. And then an optional description for the virtual machines. So here we're indicating we just want to deploy one virtual machine. We can enter the virtual machine suffix if we want. Here we can choose a list from a list of virtual machine templates which VM template we want to use. And you'll notice that this list of VM templates has been scoped down based upon which cloud resource subscription I wanted to use. So I only see these 2 VM templates, even though I have more of them available in the database. And here we choose which logical network we want to use. And again, this is scoped down to just those that are associated with the cloud resource subscription. We set a decommission date, and then enter in which users are going to be the owners of this virtual machine, and submit this request. Now, one quick point about that decommission date, that's just a datetime field that we store as part of the request for this virtual machine. There are no out-of-the-box workflows for actually decommissioning the virtual machine, but it would be easy enough to create that type of thing using Orchestrator. Okay, so now we have a new service request, a new VM. We'll open this up. And as we saw before, you can see who the requester is, the information that they provided. And then over on the Activities tab, we can see the process for fulfilling this type of request. The first thing that happens is a activity runs inside of Service Manager that goes and gets all of the cloud resource administrators and adds those as reviewers on the review activity. So if we now open up this review activity, we'll see that all those people that are cloud resource subscription people are added as approvers on here. And now each of these approvers can go through and they can approve this request. And this can be done either through the Service Manager console, as you see here, or through the self-service portal, or through the Exchange connector by simply responding to an email notification. And you can also have voting logic, which is either percentage-based or unanimous. And then the next step here is that, I just kind of missed this here. Real quick, we'll go back. So you'll notice here that the next step in the process is this pre-virtual machine manager activity right here. So this is actually an activity that runs inside of Service Manager that does some work ahead of calling this runbook inside of Orchestrator. So once that runbook runs, you can see the status of that being executed over on the Orchestrator side. Here we can see that particular instance of the runbook was run. This is what the runbook looks like. Sorry, just going back here 1 second. Right, so okay, so this Orchestrator Runbook, as we saw before, has an initialized data activity that passes in the activity ID, as well as the input data XML, has a parse input XML parser PowerShell script here, and then it creates the virtual machine inside of Virtual Machine Manager, and then it monitors for the completion of creating that virtual machine, and then it will update the activity work item back in Service Manager with the results. And then you can see, once this is kicked off, you can see that there's now this new virtual machine being created inside of Virtual Machine Manager. So as I mentioned before, this process can be either completely automated with no touch, if you want to just remove the review activities, or you can have it require approval. You can add in additional manual activities or automated activities as part of the process. and you can even have activities running in parallel as part of the process. And you can modify the Orchestrator Runbooks to add additional steps if you want to as well. Okay, so let's go back now to the slide deck, and just kind of get to the end here with some question and answer period. So that's the end of the demos. Hopefully this gives you a good idea of what you can do with the private cloud once you have it set up. You can onboard these tenants, you can allocate them a portion of the private cloud that they can have access to provision their VMs on, and from there they can also do other things. So once you get this set up, you can then update the tenant registration. You can grant them more or less resources by modifying their cloud resource subscription. You can update virtual machine properties, and you can deprovision tenants and cloud resources as well. So these are some of the most common scenarios that you would want to do around private cloud management, but there are others. And so using the same concepts that we used to build the cloud services management pack out of the box, you can create your own custom processes and workflows and runbooks to automate your private cloud management as well. And there's quite a few demos and things like that that I've done on the web that show you kind of step-by-step how to do that. So in terms of what's next, as I mentioned, this is the first part in an 8-part webcast, and the next session that we do will be to talk about the hardware and software prerequisites required in order to be able to set up a private cloud. And we'll go through actually provisioning all of that hardware and software prerequisites, showing you how to set that up in a way that's highly available and achieves your objectives. So this webcast series will happen every Tuesday and Thursday at 11 o'clock a.m. Pacific time from now until the end of June, except for the week of TechEd US, which is June 11th through 14th. So I hope you join me in each of the remaining sessions. These sessions will be made available as recordings on the web immediately after the sessions are done. And so feel free to share them out there on the web as well with the people that you work with. So with that, we'll just wrap up here with some Q&A time. So I'll go and check the Q&A monitor here and see what we've got in the queue. Okay, so the question is, can you run some sort of report in System Center that looks at your virtual environment and compiles a list of licenses you need for the machines and services you have deployed? No, there's not something like that right now, but it is something that we and our partners are looking at. So stay tuned for that. Is there a solution for automated documentation? I think that would kind of come down to what exactly it was you wanted to document. You know, the Cloud Services Management Pack comes with a number of reports. All of the System Center components also come with reports. But if you wanted to sort of take like one of these processes and sort of automatically generate a Word document that describes what the sequence of activities is and what the runbook configuration looks like and all that sort of across the suite, no, there isn't a solution for that. Okay, obviously you've looked at VMware products. What makes your product better or different from VMware? This question is probably larger than the scope we have time for with this session, but I will point out just a couple of differentiators. One of them is that System Center is capable of managing both Hyper-V and VMware out of the box. The licensing of System Center with Hyper-V versus VMware is quite different. I encourage you to take a look at that to see what kind of cost savings might be available to you using System Center with Hyper-V versus using VMware. And lastly, I would kind of point out the integration between all of the different System Center components is very tight. So as you saw today, we actually had integration going between Service Manager, Operations Manager, Virtual Machine Manager, and Orchestrator. And it's all fairly seamless, using the different components for each of their strengths to deliver a private cloud and manage that private cloud. So having that whole suite from monitoring to ITIL and MOF service management to systems automation to virtual machine management. We didn't even touch really today on things like App Controller data protection manager for backup or configuration manager for software delivery and configuration management. Those are obviously very powerful parts of the suite as well. And with the new licensing of System Center 2012, the way it works is that whenever you get a license to System Center, you get a license to the entire suite. So there's no sort of piecemeal licensing of System Center. It's sort of an all or nothing, all you can eat type of approach. And yeah, I think in that sense it's very cost effective for customers to get all of this functionality and have it all tied together. Okay. Already did that question. Okay, is the Service Manager Data Warehouse mandatory for the Cloud Service Management Pack? No, it's not mandatory, but the reporting piece of the Cloud Services Management Pack, where you get virtual machine showback reports, will not be available without the data warehouse. That depends upon the cube that comes with the Cloud Services Management Pack that gets imported and deployed to the Service Manager Data Warehouse. Okay. Looks like that's the end of the unique questions there. So I'll go ahead and wrap it up. Again, the easiest way to get a hold of me is here on the screen. There's my Twitter handle, RadTravis, or feel free to send me an email. Obviously, I can't be a personal support resource for everyone, but if you have a quick question you'd like to ask me as a follow-up to this series, feel free to shoot me an email and I'll try to respond to you. And again, I look forward to seeing all of you at the remaining sessions in this series. Thanks again for joining.